Daughter-in-law told our entire family that I smelled like a nursing home at my son's Thanksgiving dinner. She said it loud enough for 14 people to hear, right there at the table, while I was still holding my fork. What she didn't know was that I'd been recording every word she'd said to me for the past 4 months. And what none of them knew, not my son, not her parents, not a single person sitting at that table, was that the broke old mechanic from Tulsa they'd been pitying all year was sitting on $41 million in a private trust account. Let me back up. My name is Gerald, and I spent 31 years building a specialty parts manufacturing company out of a 2-bay garage in Tulsa, Oklahoma. We made precision components for the aerospace industry. Nothing glamorous. I drove used trucks, wore the same Carhartt jacket for a decade, ate lunch at the same diner on 41st Street 3 or 4 times a week. My wife Elaine used to joke that I looked like I worked for the company instead of owned it. She wasn't wrong. After she passed from ovarian cancer 6 years ago, I sold the business to a private equity group out of Dallas for $41.3 million. Kept the house, kept the truck, kept the diner habit, kept my mouth shut about the money, mostly because Elaine always said the best way to find out who really loves you is to give them nothing to gain. I had one son. His name was my whole world. My son, Thomas. Thomas was 34, worked as a project manager for a commercial real estate firm in Denver, and had been dating a woman named Melissa for 2 years before he called to tell me they were engaged. I remember the exact moment. I was in my driveway changing the oil on my truck, and he called, and I sat down right there on the concrete and just felt the fullness of it. My kid was building a life. I drove up to Denver the following weekend to meet Melissa properly. We'd crossed paths twice at holidays, but never really talked. She was beautiful, organized, sharp. She worked in luxury property management and handled accounts for some of the nicest residential buildings in downtown Denver. Her parents, I'll call them her father and her mother, were from the Boulder area. Her father was a retired orthodontist. Her mother collected art. They had money, the kind that likes to be visible. Our first real dinner together was at a restaurant in Cherry Creek that I later looked up online. $80 entrees. I wore clean khakis and a button-down. I didn't think anything of it. Her father was in a blazer with a pocket square. Her mother wore something that probably cost more than my first car. Fine. I wasn't there to impress anyone. Melissa spent most of that dinner asking questions that weren't really questions. So, Gerald, are you still doing the mechanic thing? She said, still doing the mechanic thing, the way you'd say, still eating cereal for dinner. Thomas had apparently told her I worked in manufacturing, and somewhere between that and the breadbasket, she'd decided I was a shop floor retiree living on Social Security. I didn't correct her. I said I was mostly retired and left it at that. She nodded with that specific kind of sympathy that means she'd already filed me into a category and moved on. By dessert, she'd managed to mention twice that Thomas's career trajectory was finally heading somewhere, and once that they were looking at a 3-bedroom in a neighborhood that was probably outside what most people picture when they think Denver. That last one, she said while looking at me. I drove back to Tulsa the next morning thinking she doesn't dislike me, she just doesn't see me, and that might be worse. The months that followed confirmed it, one small cut at a time. When Thomas and Melissa came to Tulsa in the spring to look at venues for an engagement party, Melissa walked through my house with the expression of someone completing a wellness check. She touched the kitchen counter and didn't say anything. She asked if I'd thought about downsizing eventually, since it was a lot of space for one person. My house is a 4-bedroom Craftsman that Elaine and I spent 11 years renovating by hand, room by room. I told her I liked the space. She smiled the way people smile when they've decided not to argue. At the engagement party, held at a rented event space in Denver, because Melissa felt Tulsa wasn't central enough for her family, I was seated at a table near the bar with Thomas's college roommate and 2 people I'd never met. The head table, where the couple and both families sat, had 7 chairs. Mine wasn't one of them. When I mentioned it to Thomas quietly, he looked genuinely confused, like the thought hadn't occurred to him, which told me it had occurred to Melissa, and she'd handled the seating before he could think about it. The real turn came in September. Thomas called me on a Sunday evening, and I could tell immediately something was scripted about it. He said Melissa wanted to have a honest conversation about Thanksgiving. She felt strongly that this year's dinner, which they were hosting at their apartment for the first time, should be intimate, just close family. Her parents and her younger sister would be there. Her aunt and uncle were flying in from Phoenix. Her college roommate was coming with her husband, 14 people total, none of whom were related to me except my own son. I wasn't being asked not to come. I was being told it was a lot of people already, that the apartment was small, that driving from Tulsa was a long way, that they'd make it up to me at Christmas. Thomas's voice had that careful flatness of a man repeating sentences that weren't originally his. I said I understood. I told Thomas I'd talk to him soon. Then I sat in my kitchen for about 20 minutes, with the lights off, thinking about Elaine, thinking about the boy I raised, thinking about what she would have done. She would have shown up anyway. She would have thrown a pie. I didn't tell Thomas I was coming. I drove up the Tuesday before Thanksgiving, checked into a Marriott 6 blocks from their apartment, and called my friend Warren, who'd been my operations manager for 15 years before I sold the company. Warren had done 2 years of theatre in college and always said it was the most useful thing he'd ever learned. I asked him for a favor. What happened over the next 3 days took some preparation. Warren connected me with a medical supply company in Aurora that did rental equipment for home health. I rented a standard rollator walker, the kind with the tennis balls on the feet and the little seat in the middle. I bought 2 pairs of reading glasses I didn't need and left them in different pockets. I bought a cardigan from Goodwill in a beige that had no business being worn by a person with any spirit left. Warren helped me practice a slight forward lean, a hesitation before answering questions, a tendency to repeat the beginning of sentences. Nothing dramatic, nothing stroke-level obvious, just the particular physical diminishment that happens to men in their 60s when the world has decided to stop waiting for them. I also bought a small recording device, legal in Colorado, which is a one-party consent state, and slipped it into the front pocket of the cardigan. I called Thomas Thanksgiving morning and told him I'd made the drive, that I was nearby, that I wanted to see him on his first Thanksgiving as an engaged man. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Come on up, Dad. Just come up." I heard something shift in his voice, like he'd been waiting for permission to say that. When Melissa opened the door, her face did something interesting. It didn't fall exactly. It sort of rearranged itself. The smile arrived a half-second too late, the way a backup camera beeps before it's actually showing you what's behind you. "Gerald, what a surprise." She said it the way you'd say it if the surprise had a wrong answer. Thomas hugged me for a long time. Longer than usual. I could feel him saying something without words. The apartment was full. Her father stood near the window with a glass of wine, wearing the kind of casual weekend sweater that costs $200 and is designed to look like it doesn't. Her mother was in the kitchen, managing the situation around Melissa's sister, who was trying to help and being gently redirected. The aunt and uncle from Phoenix were on the couch. The college roommate's husband was talking to nobody near the bookshelf. Melissa's father shook my hand. "So you made the drive from Tulsa. Long way." He said it like a fact, with nowhere to go. I told him I didn't like to miss things. He nodded and turned back to the window. Melissa found me a folding chair from the closet and set it up at the end of the table extension. Not the wrong side, technically. Just the end that was closest to the kitchen noise and furthest from the conversation. I set my walker beside me and lowered myself into the chair slowly, the way I'd been practicing. Warren had told me, the slower you move, the more invisible you become. People stop watching because watching feels impolite. He was right. Within 15 minutes I had essentially ceased to exist in that apartment. Melissa was orchestrating everything beautifully. The music, the serving dishes, the conversation topics, which moved from real estate trends in Boulder to a restaurant that had recently opened in the Reno district to whether the aunt and uncle should buy or rent in Scottsdale. Nobody directed a question at me. I answered a few things Thomas tried to pull me into, but Melissa twice redirected the table before I'd finished my thought. Not rudely, efficiently. I ate my turkey. I watched my son try to be in 2 places at once. I kept my hand near the cardigan pocket. It was during dessert that it happened. Melissa's father had been talking about a property he'd toured in Vale, something about the elevation and the renovation costs, and I'd leaned over to reach for the cranberry sauce. My arm shook slightly. I was keeping the performance subtle, and I knocked my water glass, not over, just nudged it, and it sloshed a little onto the tablecloth. I apologized, said I was sorry, that my hands weren't always reliable lately. Melissa looked at the wet tablecloth. Then she looked at her mother, and then, in that particular register that people use when they think they're whispering but have simply decided the other person doesn't count as an audience, she said, "He shouldn't have driven. He's going to hurt someone. Look at him. He can barely manage a glass of water." Her mother made a small sound, a murmur, the kind that means, "I heard you, and I'm not stopping you." Melissa continued, "I told Thomas. I told him months ago, you need to have a real conversation with your father about what comes next. There are programs for this. There are facilities. He doesn't have to pretend everything is fine just because he doesn't want to admit he's declining." Declining. She said declining like I was a quarterly report. Thomas was at the other end of the table and didn't hear it. The aunt and uncle were talking to the roommate's husband. Her father was looking at his pie. I sat with it. I let it sit. Then Melissa's sister, younger, kinder, clearly uncomfortable, changed the subject to something about Christmas markets, and the moment passed, and everyone moved on the way people move on from things they didn't technically do. But I had it. All of it. 37 seconds on a recording in a beige cardigan pocket. I drove back to the Marriott that night and sat in the chair by the window with the lights low. I thought about Elaine again. She used to say that the cruelest people aren't the ones who yell. They're the ones who whisper because whispering means they know it's wrong and they've decided to do it anyway. Melissa knew it was wrong. She'd made sure Thomas couldn't hear. Over the next 2 weeks, I made some calls. The first was to my attorney, a woman named, I'll just say my attorney, she prefers it, who had structured the original sale of my company and managed the trust since then. I asked her to prepare documents showing the current trust balance and the conditions under which Thomas was designated as primary beneficiary. The balance as of November of that year was $41,800,000 and some thousand. I asked her to print it on firm letterhead. The second call was to Warren. The third call was to a woman I'd met at a fundraiser 2 years prior who ran the regional chapter of a disability advocacy organization. I'd written him a check at the event. Nothing major, just something to be decent. She remembered me. I told her a little about what was happening. Not everything, just the shape of it. She said, "If you're willing to tell this story publicly, we have a platform for it." I said I'd think about it. I thought about it for 4 days. Then I called her back. Christmas was at their apartment again. Thomas had asked me, this time directly, if I would come. I said yes. I drove up 2 days before and checked back into the same Marriott. Warren flew in from his place in Santa Fe. We spent an evening going over things. I wore the cardigan again, the walker, the reading glasses in 2 different pockets. Melissa's family arrived Christmas Eve. Her parents were staying in the guest room. Her sister was on an air mattress. The apartment was full and warm and decorated beautifully. She was genuinely talented at that. I want to be fair about it. The trouble started Christmas morning. I'd arrived at 8 before anyone else was up except Thomas, and we'd had coffee together at the kitchen table for almost an hour. It was the longest uninterrupted conversation we'd had in months. He told me about a project at work he was proud of. I told him about a road trip I'd been thinking about taking through the Southwest. He asked about my health, genuinely asked, not Melissa's style. And I told him I was fine, that the hands thing was probably nothing, that I'd been to my doctor and she wasn't worried. He looked relieved, then he looked guilty about being relieved. I know my son. By noon the apartment was full. Gifts were opened. Melissa's mother made a comment about my sweater that was technically a compliment. The afternoon moved toward dinner. That's when Melissa pulled Thomas into the bedroom. I know because I'd been in the hallway getting my jacket from the closet and the door wasn't fully closed and some things carry. She said, "I need you to talk to him about driving. I need you to talk to him about living alone. Gerald, this isn't sustainable. He could fall." He could have a medical event and nobody would know for days. I've done some research on assisted living communities in the Tulsa area, and some of them are genuinely nice. There's one near the river, Thomas said. Melissa, he's 63. She said, 63 with shaking hands, and no one at home, and a 4-hour drive each way. At what point do we stop pretending this is fine because it's easier than having the hard conversation? Thomas said something I couldn't make out. She said, I just don't assisted living, and there's one with a memory care unit that's only. I stepped back from the door. I went to the bathroom and ran the water and stood at the sink looking at myself in the mirror. 63 years old, built a company from a garage, raised a son alone after his mother got sick, drove 4 hours twice in 6 weeks to see my kid, and the woman he was about to marry had researched memory care units for me. I dried my hands, went back to the living room, poured myself a small glass of wine, sat down next to Melissa's father and asked him about the Vale property. He talked for 20 minutes. I listened. It was actually interesting. Dinner was served at 6. 14 people around an extended table, and this time Thomas had made sure I was next to him. Melissa gave a little speech, grateful for family, for the year, for the people around the table. She looked at me once during it with something that wasn't quite warmth and wasn't quite coldness. It was management. She was managing me. I waited until the plates were being cleared. I stood up, not dramatically. I didn't even tap my glass. I just stood up, and people noticed because the walker was there, and they'd learned to track my movements the way you track anything that seems fragile. I want to say something, I said. If that's all right. Thomas looked at me. I gave him a small nod. He didn't know what was coming, but he knew it was real. I'd like to tell everyone how grateful I am to be here, I said. I know it wasn't exactly planned. Melissa's smile was a controlled thing. I've had a remarkable year, I continued. I've done a lot of thinking about what matters, about the people in our lives who see us clearly, and the people who see what they expect to see. I reached into my jacket, not the cardigan pocket this time, my actual jacket, and pulled out the envelope my attorney had prepared. I set it on the table in front of Thomas. That's a summary of a trust I set up after I sold my manufacturing company 4 years ago. Thomas is the primary beneficiary. The current balance is in the top right corner of the first page. Thomas picked up the envelope. He opened it slowly, the way you open something when you're not sure what's inside. Then he went very still. Melissa looked at her husband's face and then at the envelope, and I watched her understand that something had shifted, though she didn't yet know how far. $41,842,000, I said, because the number mattered. The number was the thing they'd been certain about, that I didn't have it, that I was a problem to be managed, a liability in a beige cardigan. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Melissa's father said, I beg your pardon. I looked at Melissa, not unkindly. I want to be clear about that. I didn't look at her with triumph. I looked at her the way you look at someone when you want them to know that you're fully present, that you have been this entire time. I said, I've been listening carefully this year. I heard some things that I want to address. I took out my phone. I'd already queued it up. Melissa's voice came through the speaker, small and clear in the quiet room. He shouldn't have driven. He's going to hurt someone. Look at him. He can barely manage a glass of water, I told Thomas. I told him months ago, you need to have a real conversation with your father about what comes next. There are programs for this, there are facilities. The room was absolutely silent. Melissa's mother set down her fork. Melissa's sister stared at the tablecloth. Melissa herself had gone the color of the white walls behind her. Her mouth opened, closed. I turned off the recording. Thomas, I said, I love you. I have loved you since the moment you existed, and I have tried very hard this year to see this situation clearly, and not just from my side of it. I looked at Melissa again. You are smart and capable, and you've worked hard for the life you have. I respect that genuinely. But you looked at me and decided what I was worth before you knew anything real about me. You made plans for my life, where I'd live, what I'd need, whether I was safe to drive, and you made those plans the way people make plans for furniture, not for a person. The room was so quiet I could hear the refrigerator. I'm not going to disrupt this family, I continued. That's not what tonight is about. But I am going to tell you, in front of everyone who matters to both of us, what I heard. And I'm going to ask you to sit with the fact that the man you were discussing placing in a memory care facility is standing in front of you in full possession of his faculties and $41 million he was going to give your future children. Was going to, Melissa said. Her voice was barely there. I nodded. The trust conditions are going to be revised. Thomas remains the beneficiary, but I've asked my attorney to add a clause if he remains married to someone who cannot speak about his father with basic respect. Specifically, cannot resist discussing memory care facilities for a 63-year-old man who has given her no medical reason to, then $20 million of it is redirected to organizations I've been researching for the past 3 weeks. I looked at Melissa's father, who was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite name. I've already committed $500,000 to the Colorado Center for Disability Rights, I said, and another $250,000 to a National Foundation for Elder Care Dignity. Those checks are signed. Those are done regardless of what anyone decides tonight. Melissa's mother reached across the table and touched her daughter's hand. Melissa was crying. I want to be honest about that. She was crying, and it wasn't performance. I could see the real version of it. I sat back down. I picked up my wine glass. My hand was completely steady. Thomas sat next to me without speaking for a long time. Then he put his hand on my arm, the way he used to when he was small and something had frightened him. And he said, "Dad, I didn't know." "I know you didn't," I said. "Dad, I didn't know." I said. He said, "I'm sorry. I told him he had nothing to be sorry for. I told him we'd talk tomorrow, just the two of us, and that everything would be okay because I believed that." The dinner ended early. Melissa's parents left first, quietly. Her sister hugged me on the way out and said she was glad I'd come. I thought that was brave of her. Melissa and Thomas talked for a long time after everyone was gone. I went back to the Marriott, ordered room service, and watched an old movie I'd seen 15 times. I slept well. What happened in the months after that took its own shape, the way things do when you give them space. Thomas and Melissa did not break up immediately. I want to be honest about that, because the story where everything resolves neatly in one night isn't the true one. They went to counseling. Thomas told me about it in January, over the phone, his voice careful and real. He said Melissa had things to work through, that some of it went back further than him, that she'd grown up in a family where worth was visible, and anything that couldn't be displayed was a kind of embarrassment. He said she wasn't a bad person. I believed him. I'd never thought she was a bad person. Bad people are simpler. By March, I'd met with the Disability Rights Organization in person. The director, a woman about 10 years younger than me who'd spent her career fighting for people who couldn't fight for themselves, asked me if I'd be willing to speak at their annual fundraising dinner. I said yes without thinking about it too long. I told the story that night to a room of about 300 people, not the full version, the version that mattered, about what it feels like to become invisible when people decide you have nothing left to offer, about how that happens to people every day who don't have $41 million to stand back up with, about how we decide who counts before we've done the basic work of finding out. A man came up to me afterward. He was in his late 70s, and he had a walker that was considerably more worn than the rented one I'd used in Denver. He said, "My son-in-law talks about me like that when he thinks I'm asleep." I didn't know what to say that would be enough, so I just sat with him for a while. Thomas called me that same week. He and Melissa were still together, still in counseling, but he said something had changed since Christmas. He said she'd started asking about me differently, not managing, asking. He said she'd watched a documentary about elder care in America and had sent him an article about it at 11 at night with no message, just the link. He said he thought that meant something. I said I thought it did too. The trust conditions were formally revised in April. Thomas remained the primary beneficiary, full amount, with one amendment, a clause my attorney called, in the driest legal language possible, the dignity provision. It required no specific action from Melissa, no test, no performance. It simply stated that the trustee, me, for now, reserved the right to redirect funds to designated charitable organizations if, in his sole judgment, The manner in which his son's household conducted itself toward vulnerable family members demonstrated a pattern inconsistent with basic human decency. My attorney said she'd never written anything quite like it. I told her I hoped she'd never have to invoke it. She said she hoped so too, by the following Thanksgiving. The real one, the one that came around again the way all things do. I drove up to Denver without the cardigan, without the walker, without the reading glasses in the wrong pockets. I brought a pie from a bakery in Tulsa that Elaine had loved. I knocked on the door. Melissa opened it. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "I'm glad you came." I believed her. Not completely, not yet, but enough. Enough to come in, enough to set the pie on the counter, enough to sit at the table, the real table, not the extension end, and eat dinner with my son and the woman he loved, in all the complicated, unfinished, still becoming truth of that. Some tests don't end with a single moment. Some of them just keep going. I've made my peace with that. Elaine would have said, "Good." She always thought the long version was the honest one. I've thought a lot about what really happened at Christmas, and I don't think it was about the money. The money was just the part that made people stop and listen. The real thing, the thing I keep coming back to, is how quickly and completely a person can be decided upon. Melissa didn't hate me. That would have required her to actually see me first. What she did was faster and in some ways colder than hate. She looked at a man in a worn cardigan with a slight tremor in his hands and made a complete determination about his worth, his future, his right to be present in his own son's life, and then she acted on that determination, consistently over months, with the quiet confidence of someone who believed she was simply being practical. That's the part that I think about when I'm driving back from Denver, or sitting in my kitchen on a Tuesday morning with coffee. Not the anger of it. The anger faded faster than I expected. What stayed was the recognition, because Melissa isn't unusual. The way she treated me is the way a lot of people treat anyone they've decided has already peaked. Older men, people with disabilities, anyone whose outward circumstances suggest diminishment. The treatment isn't always loud. Usually it's exactly what I experienced: the folding chair at the end of the extension table, the redirected conversation, the whispered concern that's really just management dressed up in the language of care. What I did with the walker and the cardigan and the recorder. I've had people ask me whether it was right, whether it was fair to Melissa, whether I manipulated the situation. I've sat with that question honestly, and what I keep arriving at is this: I didn't create the situation. I revealed it. There's a difference between setting a trap and holding up a mirror. Melissa showed me over and over again, in private and in front of others, exactly what she thought of me. I just made sure that what happened in private didn't stay there. What Thomas did in the months after Christmas showed me something I already believed but needed to see confirmed: that character isn't fixed, and neither is a marriage. He didn't walk away from Melissa when the easier thing would have been to pick a side and simplify his life. He stayed and did the harder thing, which was to hold space for two true things at once: that his wife had behaved badly, and that she was also someone worth believing in. I don't know where that kind of patience comes from in a person. Some of it I'd like to think I gave him. Some of it is just him. I've spoken about this publicly a few times now, in front of rooms full of strangers, and the part that always lands the hardest isn't the $41 million. It's the man who came up to me after the first speech, the one in his late 70s with the warm walker, who told me his son-in-law talked about him the same way when he thought he was asleep. That man doesn't have a trust fund. He doesn't have a trust fund. He doesn't have a recording device in his cardigan pocket. He just has a life that someone decided had already finished, and nobody's held up a mirror. I think about him more than I think about Melissa. I think about all the versions of him. And I think about what Elaine said, that the best way to find out who really loves you is to give them nothing to gain. She was right. She usually was. But I'd add one thing she left out. Once you know, you have to decide what to do with that knowledge, whether to walk away or stay, whether to punish or wait, whether to hold the door open or let it close. That decision is the whole of it, really. Everything else is just the story you tell about how you got there.